My name's Bridget Calloway. I'm 34, and I want to start with the text message that made me realize something had happened to my dead husband's tools without me knowing anything about it. Hey Bridget, weird question. Did you know Roy's old toolbox and the big red Craftsman cabinet showed up at the county fairgrounds auction last weekend? I saw them listed and almost bought the cabinet myself before I realized whose it probably was. Just wanted to check with you first. That text came from Desmond, my late husband's coworker of almost 11 years, a guy who'd worked alongside Roy at the county maintenance department since before we even met. I read it standing in my kitchen, and I remember my hands actually going cold, because as far as I knew, every single one of Roy's tools was still sitting exactly where they'd been since the day he died, 14 months earlier, in the garage of the house I still lived in. Except apparently they weren't. Okay, let me back up, because you need the full picture before any of this makes sense. Roy and I were married for 9 years. He worked as a heavy equipment mechanic for the county, the kind of guy who came home every day smelling like diesel and metal, hands permanently a little stained no matter how much he scrubbed them. He loved his tools in a way that's hard to explain if you didn't know him. Not just as equipment, as history. Some of that toolbox had belonged to his own father, who'd taught him the trade before passing away himself back when Roy was in his 20s. Certain wrenches, certain specific pieces, carried actual sentimental weight for him, stories attached to specific jobs, specific repairs, specific moments in his life. Roy died 18 months ago now. Heart attack, sudden, no warning, standing in our own garage on a Saturday morning, doing something as simple as changing the oil in my car. I found him myself. I don't need to walk you through those details. I think you can understand enough from that alone. After he died, I did what I think a lot of people do in that first wave of grief. I froze, essentially, when it came to his things. His clothes stayed in the closet for almost a year before I could bring myself to sort through them. His truck sat in the driveway for months before I finally sold it, mostly because insurance costs forced my hand rather than any actual readiness on my part. And his tools, his entire garage setup, stayed exactly as he'd left them, because touching that felt like erasing something I wasn't ready to let go of yet. I want to explain my family situation too, because it matters for how this whole thing unfolded. I grew up in Millbrook, Kentucky, a small town where my parents, Wade and Loretta Prentice, still lived, along with my older brother Garrett, who lived about 20 minutes away with his wife and 3 kids. Roy and I had settled in the same general area after we got married, close enough to family that we saw them regularly. Holidays, Sunday dinners, the whole small-town family rhythm. My parents were good people, generally, but they'd always had a particular way of inserting themselves into decisions they considered themselves entitled to weigh in on, especially once Roy died and I was, in their eyes, suddenly a vulnerable young widow who needed guidance managing her own affairs. My mother, in particular, had strong opinions about how quickly I should be moving forward, a phrase I heard constantly during that first year, usually attached to suggestions about things I should sell, donate, or otherwise clear out of the house, to make room for whatever version of my future she'd already decided I should be building. About a year after Roy died, my brother Garrett hit a genuinely difficult financial stretch. His construction business had taken a hit during a slow season, and he was behind on payments for some newer equipment he'd financed, a situation serious enough that he was at real risk of losing several pieces of machinery back to the lender if he couldn't catch up within a few months. I knew about Garrett's struggles in a general sense, the way you know about a sibling's financial stress without necessarily knowing every specific detail. What I didn't know, what I found out only because of that accidental text from Desmond, was that my parents had decided, apparently on their own, that the solution to Garrett's problem involved my dead husband's tools. I called Desmond back within about 10 minutes of getting that text, my hands still shaking a little as I dialed. "Desmond, what exactly did you see?" I asked. "Tell me everything." He explained that he'd been at the county fairgrounds the previous Saturday for a regular monthly equipment and estate auction, something he attended occasionally, looking for deals on tools for his own garage. About halfway through the auction, a red Craftsman tool cabinet came up for bidding, one he recognized immediately because he'd literally stood next to Roy while Roy assembled that exact cabinet years earlier, helped him carry it into the garage the day it arrived. "I almost bid on it," Desmond said, because it looked like such a good deal, and it took me a second to place why it looked so familiar. Then, I saw the toolbox that came up right after it, and I recognized some specific tools inside when they opened it up for bidders to inspect. That's when I knew for sure. That was Roy's stuff. I asked him who had actually brought the tools to the auction, whether he'd seen anyone specific dropping them off or listed as the consignor. "I didn't see who dropped them off originally," he said, "but I did overhear the auctioneer mention the consignor's name during the paperwork exchange after the cabinet sold. It was Apprentice. I remember because I thought it was odd, since that's your maiden name, and I wasn't sure if maybe you'd decided to sell some things yourself and just hadn't mentioned it. Prentice. My family's name. Not Calloway, which was Roy's name and mine since marriage." I felt something cold and sick settle into my stomach as the pieces started coming together. I hadn't given anyone permission to sell anything from that garage. As far as I knew, every single tool was still sitting exactly where Roy had left it. I drove out to my own garage the moment I got off the phone with Desmond, and that's when the full scope of what had happened actually hit me. The big red Craftsman cabinet, the centerpiece of Roy's entire setup, the one his coworkers had helped him carry in, was gone. So was his main rolling toolbox. So were several smaller cases I recognized immediately by their absence. Spaces on the pegboard wall where specific tools used to hang, now just empty outlines in the dust. I called my mother immediately, my voice, I'm sure, shaking with something between confusion and dawning anger. "Mom, did you take tools out of my garage?" There was a pause, a long one, the kind of pause that told me, before she even answered, that whatever explanation was coming had already been prepared in advance, waiting for exactly this question. "Your father and Garrett came by a few weeks ago," she said finally. "We didn't think you'd mind, honestly. You hadn't touched any of that stuff in over a year, Bridget. It was just sitting there, gathering dust. Garrett needed help catching up on his equipment loans, and we thought, since those tools weren't being used anyway, it made more sense for them to actually help someone rather than just sit in a garage forever." I sat down right there in my own driveway, the phone pressed against my ear, feeling something break loose inside my chest that I don't think I'd ever quite felt before in my life. "Those were Roy's tools," I said, my voice coming out flatter than I expected. "Some of them belonged to his father. You didn't ask me. You didn't even tell me. You just took them and sold them at a public auction. We didn't think it would upset you this much," she said. "We were trying to help your brother. We thought you'd understand, since family helps family. Family helps family. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, because it's going to come back around later in this story, in a way that matters." I asked her how much they'd gotten for everything, and she named a figure, just under $6,000, for tools that, honestly, given some of the specific pieces and their sentimental history, probably weren't fairly valued at auction prices anyway. But that's a separate issue from the fact that none of it should have been sold in the first place without my knowledge or consent. I confronted my father next, hoping maybe he'd have a more reasonable explanation, since he'd always seemed slightly less inclined than my mother to make unilateral decisions about other people's lives. "We figured Garrett needed it more than those tools sitting unused," he said, essentially repeating my mother's justification, with only slightly different wording. "We were going to tell you eventually, once things settled down with Garrett's situation." "Eventually," I repeated, "after it was already done, after the tools were already gone and the money already spent." He didn't have a good response to that. I didn't confront Garrett right away, honestly, because I genuinely wasn't sure how much he actually knew about where those tools had come from versus how much this had been my parents' initiative that he'd simply accepted without asking too many questions. I called him a couple days later, once I'd had time to actually process everything instead of just reacting in the moment. "Garrett, did you know those tools you got money from were Roy's?" There was a long pause on his end, too, and I could hear something like genuine discomfort in his voice when he finally answered. "Mom and Dad told me they'd cleared it with you," he said. "I swear, Bridget, they told me you'd said it was fine, that you wanted to help me out and didn't need the tools anymore since you weren't using them." I believed him, actually, hearing the specific way he said it, the genuine surprise in his voice. I don't think Garrett set out to steal from his sister's dead husband's memory. I think he simply accepted what our parents told him, the way you do when your own parents present something as already settled and approved, especially when you're desperate enough for the help that you're not inclined to ask too many follow-up questions. That's almost worse, in a way, when I really sit with it. Not a coordinated scheme between siblings. Just my parents deciding, unilaterally, that my grief and my ownership of my own husband's memory mattered less than solving Garrett's financial problem quickly and quietly. Here's where I had to figure out what I actually wanted to do about all this, because knowing the truth and knowing how to respond to it turned out to be two very different challenges. I want to be honest that my first instinct was pure anger, the kind that wanted to demand everything back immediately, make a scene, force some kind of dramatic reckoning. But most of those tools were already gone, sold to individual buyers at that auction, scattered now across probably a dozen different garages throughout the county. There wasn't really a clean way to just undo what had already happened. I called a lawyer anyway, mostly just to understand my actual options, a woman named Carla Ostrowski, who handled some general civil matters in addition to her main estate planning practice. Carla explained that legally, since I was Roy's sole heir and the tools were unambiguously part of his estate, which I'd fully inherited, my parents' actions constituted theft, plain and simple, regardless of their intentions or their belief that I wouldn't mind. Whether pursuing formal charges made sense, though, was a much more personal decision than a legal one, since this involved my own parents and brother, not strangers. You have every right to pursue this legally if you want to, Carla told me. But given the family dynamics you're describing, I'd encourage you to think carefully about what outcome you're actually hoping for before deciding how hard to push this. I sat with that advice for almost 2 weeks, honestly, going back and forth on what I actually wanted. Part of me wanted my parents to face real consequences, something beyond just an awkward conversation and a vague promise to make things right eventually. But another part of me recognized that pursuing criminal charges against my own parents over tools that, however sentimentally important, weren't going to bring Roy back or restore what had actually been lost, might cost me more in the long run than it would ever actually gain me. I decided on a middle path, one that I think mattered more to me, ultimately, than any legal reckoning would have. I told my parents, in a conversation I specifically asked to have with both of them together, along with Garrett present as well, that I wanted the full auction proceeds returned to me, all $6,000, regardless of whether Garrett had already spent any of it on his equipment loans. I told them this wasn't really about the money itself, not primarily, but about the principle that you don't get to decide, unilaterally, that someone else's grief has an expiration date convenient enough to justify taking things that were never yours to take. I also told them something else, something that I think actually landed harder than the demand for repayment. I need you to understand, I said, looking specifically at my mother, since she'd been the one to frame this whole situation as help I supposedly needed, whether I wanted it or not, that those tools weren't just objects sitting unused. They were the last physical connection I had to watching Roy work, to the specific things his hands touched every single day for years. You don't get to decide that connection matters less than Garrett's equipment loans, just because it was convenient for you to believe that. My mother cried. Eventually, real tears this time, not the deflecting kind she'd used on the phone initially. I think, faced directly with what she'd actually taken from me, rather than the sanitized version she'd told herself to justify the decision, something actually landed for the first time. They repaid the full $6,000 over the following 2 months, Garrett contributing a portion of it himself once he understood the full weight of what had happened, even though he genuinely hadn't known the truth at the time he benefited from it. Here's what I did with that money, though, because I think this part matters more than the repayment itself. I used it to commission a custom memorial piece, working with a local metalworker who specialized in exactly this kind of thing, a woman named Fern Whitlow. I brought her the few tools that hadn't been part of that auction. The smaller pieces I'd kept separately in the house rather than the garage, things Roy used to keep in a drawer in our home office for quick repairs. Fern helped me design a shadow box, a genuine piece of art, incorporating some of those remaining tools alongside a few photos, mounted in a way that finally gave Roy's memory a proper place in our house, rather than just sitting untouched and gathering dust, the way everything had been for over a year. That shadow box hangs in our living room now, in a spot where I actually see it every single day, rather than avoiding an entire garage the way I had been avoiding Roy's tools before all of this happened. Desmond, the coworker whose text started this whole thing, actually helped me track down a few of the specific pieces that had gone to individual buyers at that auction, guys he knew personally from the maintenance department who'd attended that same sale. A couple of them, once they understood the situation, actually agreed to sell certain sentimental pieces back to me at the same price they'd paid, which meant something to me more than I expected it would, strangers showing more consideration for Roy's memory than my own parents initially had. My relationship with my parents is still working through the damage from all this. Honestly, it's been about 4 months since the repayment finished, and things are still careful between us, more careful than they used to be. My mother has apologized multiple times now, genuinely, I think, rather than just going through motions. But something shifted permanently in how much I trust her judgment when it comes to decisions that affect things I actually care about. Garrett and I are closer, in some ways, than we were before this happened, mostly because he's been more honest with me since then about his own struggles, rather than letting our parents manage the narrative around his situation the way they always used to. He paid me back his portion in full, plus a little extra, an unprompted gesture that meant more to me than the actual dollar amount involved. Sometimes I think about that text message from Desmond, how close I came to never actually knowing what happened if he hadn't happened to be at that specific auction, hadn't happened to recognize that cabinet before bidding on it himself, hadn't happened to think it was worth reaching out to check with me first, instead of just assuming everything was fine. I don't know what would have happened if that text never came. Maybe I'd have gone into my garage eventually, months or years from now, finally ready to sort through Roy's things myself, only to discover everything already gone, with no idea when it happened or where any of it ended up, no chance at all to reclaim even the smallest pieces that actually mattered to me. But the text did come, and because of it, I got some of those pieces back, got real accountability from my family, instead of a quiet, permanent loss I never would have understood the shape of, and got the chance to finally give Roy's memory the kind of proper place in my life that I don't think I was ready to create for myself until everything else forced my hand. That's really the whole story, when I sit back and think about it honestly. Not some big dramatic courtroom battle, no screaming confrontation, just a text message that wasn't supposed to reveal anything, a family that decided grief has a convenient expiration date, and a widow who had to finally, forcefully, make clear that some things are never really just sitting there, unused, waiting for someone else's permission to matter less than they actually do.